Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar, A Long-Termist Approach to Animal Advocacy. Thank you so much for joining us today, and greetings to those who will be watching the recording on our YouTube channel. I am Lucia Guy, the Professor of Law and the co-founder of the Institute of Animal Law of Asia, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Institute of Animal Law of Asia, or ILA, is the educational research center that focuses on animal law issues in Asia and the world. At the ILA, we provide research projects which include animal law in Asian countries, on topic, on category, and on species animal law articles. Since last September, we have launched the external project, which is amplifying the interests of animals in Kazakhstan under the Global Ambassador Program. This project is sponsored and supported by the Center for Animal Law Studies, Lewis and Clark Law School. At the ILA, we have our news source, Asia Animal Law Bulletin, which provides the latest updates on animals in Asian countries and regions. And also we have the Alliance for Animal Law of Asia, which is the international networking campaign that aims to cooperate with national, regional, and global animal organizations through legal education, collaboration, online events and webinars, as well as inviting experts to share their experience and knowledge with our audience. Our members are spread across the globe, from Asian organizations in China, India, Japan, Indonesia, Cambodia, and Vietnam, to the organizations on other continents, including North America, South America, Europe, and Africa. In case if you missed any of our past events and or webinars, you can find the recordings on our website. It's ilasia.org/events, or go to our YouTube channel. It's Institute of Animal Law of Asia, and find the recordings up there. Please don't forget to check out our website. It's ilasia.org, and follow us on social media. It's Animal Law Asia on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Currently, I am the ambassador of the Global Ambassador Program, the initiative launched by the Center for Animal Law Studies, Lewis and Clark Law School. And today's webinar is organized under the project I'm leading, Amplifying the Interests of Animals in Kazakhstan. This wouldn't have been possible without the CAL support. Our guest today is Oscar Horta, the founder of Animal Ethics and professor of philosophy at the University of Santiago de Compostela. Oscar is a Spanish animal activist and moral philosopher. He has worked on the concept of speciesism and on the clarification of the arguments for the moral consideration of non-human animals, and also has been involved in animal advocacy since the mid-90s. Oscar has more than 100 academic publications, most of them focused on speciesism and wild animal suffering, including his upcoming book, Making a Stand for Animals. I was honored to be one of the first readers of this book, so I highly recommend reading this. It will be useful both for new animal rights activists and also for experienced animal activists and scholars, professors, and those who are interested in animal protection. The book will be available for pre-order in June. You can find the link to the book in the chat box. Thank you again for being with us today, Oscar. It's an honor to have you as our guest, and we'll be answering questions after the presentation, so please drop your questions in the Q&A box.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for the work you are doing. It's amazing, and I'm very happy that you read the book. Okay, well, so thank you very much, and yeah, it's, as I said, a pleasure to be here today with you, and I'm going to be talking about an issue that it's, I think, very important, but that has been somehow disregarded both by animal ethicists and people working in animal studies, and in addition, which is more important, by animal advocates, which is the importance of the future, not just the near future, but the far future, and the need to assume a long-termist approach then to animal advocacy. So the way in which I will assess this in this presentation is as follows. First, I will present what are the reasons for long-termism, why we should accept this approach, what are the objections that can be presented to it, and how we can respond to them. Then I will speak about some future risks affecting all sentient beings, potentially. And then I will speak about what adopting a long-termist approach in animal advocacy would mean. So let's start then with the first part. Now, the case for long-termism is relatively simple. It's based on very common sense assumptions. So the first one is that there will be in the future many more sentient beings that there are in the present, or actually, to be a bit more accurate, in the long term, there will be many more sentient beings around than in the near future. This is because, of course, the far future will last for way longer than the near future. So this seems relatively easy to understand. And we are not talking just about a few more beings. We are talking about many more, like many orders of magnitude more. So this would be like the first premise. Then the second premise is that we shouldn't be discriminated against someone just based on the time at which that individual exists. So given this, it doesn't matter whether a being will exist 10 years from now, or 100 years from now, or 1,000 years from now. We should take them all into account, any being who exists. So the final premise then would be that our current actions don't just have impact in the near future, they will also influence the far future. So if we consider all these things together, it seems that what will happen in the long term should be of primary importance, and we should give much more importance to it than we are giving now. Of course, against this, we could present several objections. So one of them would be that present beings, for whatever reason, count for more. But as we've seen, it seems that this would be a form of discrimination, because the time at which someone exists seems to be like morally irrelevant. It's like the space, the place where one exists. It doesn't really matter. What matters is whether someone is able to feel and to suffer. Then we could also claim, and this would be a different reason, that we know the present but not the future. So this would be like a more pragmatic consideration, right? But the thing is that it's not that we really know the present or the near future. Rather, we are better at forecasting what will happen in the near future than we are in the case of the far future. And this seems uncontroversial. But the thing is that what matters more is different from what it is easier to forecast. And what we should be taking into account is what matters more, regardless of whether it's more difficult to address it. Then another objection is that our impact in the present, our impact on the present will be or is more significant than in the future. And what happens here, in fact, is that a direct impact need not be necessarily a higher impact. What happens is that our impact on the present is more direct, but that doesn't mean necessarily that is like more important, right? Suppose, for instance, that you rescue just one animal, you rescue a dog, right? And suppose that instead of doing this, you could, for whatever reason, be convincing 1,000 people to go vegan. Your impact in the case of the dog would be direct, while your impact in the case of the vegan people, in terms of saving animals by convincing them, would be pretty indirect. But nevertheless, it seems uncontroversial, be higher. And that's what we should be taking into account. Then, if this is so, why are people typically concerned with the near term and not with the far future? Well, the thing is that we have a number of biases. We do have a bias toward the present that acts directly here and drives us to just be concerned about what's going on right now. And we also have a bias towards the near. So it seems that what will happen soon, somehow psychologically, we are designed to regard as more important, even if it's not necessarily more important. Then in addition to this, we have what's called an availability bias. That is, we tend to consider more relevant, more important, that which we are more in touch with, that of which we have had already some information. And the thing is that we have not been in touch with the far future or with what will happen there, while we are definitely in touch with what's going on in the present, and what's going to be happening in the near future will be relatively closer to what's going on in the present. And that explains why the near future attracts us more. And then there is another bias operating here, which is that we tend to consider more important what's easier for us to evaluate. And the impact of our actions in the near future is easier to evaluate than the impact of our actions in the on the far future. But again, the capacity that we may have to evaluate something doesn't necessarily correlate to the more important impact than we can have. So if we have to choose between having, like for instance, saving 1,000 animals for certain, or else saving a number of animals that we don't know what number it may be, but it may be between, say, 900 and 1 million, well, it seems that the latter should be a more promising course of action, even if it's harder to evaluate what we would achieve with that. Then there are other different biases that don't directly drive us to be short-termist, but nevertheless reinforces our attitudes to being so. So one is the bandwagon effect. So because most people currently are short-termist, we are somehow inclined to just follow suit and accepting short-termism as well. In addition, we all tend to be conservatives when it comes to our beliefs. It's hard for us to change our beliefs. And because we've been, or most people has been, short-termist for most of their lives, then we have a tendency to continue to act in the same way without rethinking our views. In addition, wishful thinking is a powerful bias that affects us. And because the far future, as we'll see later, may be pretty bad, we prefer not to think of those things. And even if the present already is bad, or if the far future, or is the near future may be expected to be bad, we prefer to focus on this rather than to consider even worse catastrophic scenarios that may occur in the future. Now, this doesn't necessarily correlate with a short-termist view, but in light of certain expectations that the far future may be very, very bad, it can also be a consideration for us not to think about that. Okay. Now, finally, there are a group of biases that lead us to be concerned with what happened now that are related to moral views. So one is partiality, because most of the individuals we know, whether humans or non-humans, exist now, we have a tendency to care for them and thus to care about what happens now. In addition, most people are speciesists, are anthropocentric species, and therefore they tend to favor whatever happens to human beings. And that leads them to not be considering what will happen to other beings in the far future. And then we also have an attitude of approval to what's natural. And this prevents us from considering as important natural harms that may happen to animals also in the future. Now, of course, as I said before, these biases don't necessarily directly relate to a preference for short-termism, but sometimes they prevent us from following the courses of action that may lead us to avoid particularly bad scenarios that will happen in the far future. Okay, so now that I've presented more or less why we have reasons to be long-termists and what are the considerations that may drive us not to accept this, we'll see what are the considerations that we may take into account regarding what future risks for sentient beings may be. So the first question we need to ask here is what are the points, what are the questions that if we are animal activists and we accept long-termism, we should consider when it comes to designing our strategy. So in order to do this, we need to consider first how the future may be for all sentient beings, and second, what different scenarios might take place. The first point is very interesting because the thing is that we could accept what long-termism implies, but then we may not accept it for all sentient beings. For instance, we may assume an anthropocentric viewpoint. Now, this is interesting because among those who care primarily about humans and accept a long-termist viewpoint, we can find two different views. So among them, we have people who have a more optimistic approach, and their focus typically is with avoiding human extinction. And then there are other people who are maybe a bit less optimistic, and they focus on preventing risks of massive forms of future suffering from taking place. Well, if we consider what the future may be like for all sentient beings, and that includes, of course, non-human animals and maybe other beings that could exist in the future. Well, the thing is that it seems that this second point of preventing scenarios of future suffering becomes mainly the chief consideration. And then the different scenarios that might take place will be concerning for us, especially when they entail different ways in which there may be massive forms of suffering for sentient beings. So we're gonna see now what these different scenarios may be. So to start with, well, we are all familiar with the different forms animal exploitation has. But what may happen in the future is that animal exploitation is expanded. So many, many more animals are exploited in the future. There is no reason to think that this may not occur. In addition, oh, sorry, there is here a repetition of a term. Wild animal suffering may be expanded as well. And finally, there may be new forms of harming sentient beings. New forms of harming sentient beings that we, because they are new, we can maybe guess, but we don't know what they may be. So in order to see how we could be driven to these scenarios, it's useful to think that among the different ways in which certain individuals can be caused to suffer, maybe at a massive scale, there may be different ways. And one is due to just a lack of consideration for them. So how can this be? Well, if three factors occurs together, this may occur. So one of the factors is that a new technology appears that is potentially disastrous for certain being. And it just so happens that this new technology is also beneficial for other beings, right? So if this happens, and it's also the case that the beings who are potentially benefited by this technology don't care about what happens to those that are harmed, then we have there a recipe for disaster, because those who are benefited by this new technology will have reasons to apply it in ways that cause tremendous suffering to others. And it's not difficult to think of cases of this. One of these cases, of course, is that of animal farming, and more in particular, of the current ways in which animal farming takes place, right? So this is something that can be done due to new technologies that are terribly harmful for animals, and that maybe they are beneficial for human beings. Of course, we could say that they are also harmful in different ways for human beings, but there are some benefits that they can get out of that, which means that they put it into action just because they don't care about what happens to animals, so they don't care really very much about what happens to non-human animals. It's not that people want to harm animals, so they then build factory farms in order to be there causing suffering to the animals. No, possibly most people wouldn't want to cause this suffering to animals. It's just that they don't care enough about them to avoid them. And what's interesting is that just as this has happened now, some new forms of exploiting animals could take place in the future, and we may not be preventing them. And to see this, we can consider what the situation was in the past. So this is a picture from a long time ago, more than 100 years ago. It's an anti-vivisection protest. So people concerned with animals, for instance, in Victorian Britain and in other places in the 19th century and the early 20th century, were doing different campaigns for non-human animals, but they couldn't imagine that something like factory farm could take place. Or maybe they could imagine it, but because they did not have a long-termist approach, they didn't know how to prevent it, right? Because, well, factories existed already there. So if they had been especially brilliant, they could have guessed that something of the kind could occur, and if they were not short-termists. And in the same way, currently, we face the expansion and the development of new forms of exploitation, such as aquatic farms. And these include farms of vertebrates, but also of invertebrates. And also when it comes to invertebrate farming, we of course have the reality of insect farming, which is spreading in massive ways in the present. So there's no reason to think that something new could also happen in the future that we just aren't struggling enough to figure out and to try to prevent. Now, in addition to this, there are other ways in which massive forms of suffering could happen in the future for non-human animals. So, well, it may be that humans want to hurt them intentionally. This is what happens in the case of forms of animal cruelty. Also, I mean, intentional animal cruelty. Also, sometimes humans harm animals without noticing it. This is another way in which extreme suffering could occur. And then, and this may be more interesting, it may be that humans allow or promote that non-human animals suffer or other sentient beings suffer due to natural harms. And in this case, we have a good example right now, which is that of wild animal suffering. So in recent years, there has been an increase in concern for this issue. And there are people helping wild animals in many different ways all around the world, rescuing, for instance, animals that are injured, sick, orphaned, that are trapped, stranded in beaches, etc. Sometimes this is done in institutionalized ways. It's not just individual people acting, but there are also centers that rescue these animals. And there are other initiatives, for instance, wild animal vaccination programs. So this is not that people go there and vaccinate animals one by one, but typically what they do is they introduce the vaccine in oral baits that are dropped from the sky, for instance, in helicopters, as you can see in this picture. And these measures are very important because against what many people think, the fact is that animals suffer in the wild for a number of reasons, including, for instance, accident, hostile weather conditions, disease, parasitism, hunger, thirst, etc. And this can cause terrible suffering to very, very large numbers of individuals. And here it may be useful to bear in mind that the vast majority of animals reproduce by having large numbers of offspring. Sorry, I have a non-human animal here that is wanting to say something about that as well, but I hope I can keep her quiet. Okay. And the reality then is that wild animal suffering could spread, could expand in ways that we don't foresee right now. I'll put an example of this later. Then what happens then is that there are risks of future suffering in the future. For short, these are called in the literature as risks, and these risks are non-negligible and they are easy to overlook. And then we should be figuring out then what to do about them. Of course, there are objections that we could present here. So for instance, and this wouldn't be objections against the idea of long-termism, but against the idea that we could do something about future risks for non-human animals, rather than, for instance, focusing on what happens now. So one possible objection would be that in the future, it's likely that things will improve due to moral progress. But the thing is that there are risks that this will not happen, because it may be that for whatever reason, such moral progress doesn't occur. And if moral progress does occur, then it may well be because of our action today. It may be that moral progress depends on having a long-termist approach right now. Then in addition, we may think, well, in the future, it will be easier to deal with these problems, to deal with these risks. But there may be risks, or there are risks that maybe they won't be that easy to tackle once these risks have somehow consolidated in a very significant threat to animals. And the thing is that those who in the future may be in a situation to help animals, even if suppose that it's easier for them to deal with these animals, it may be that they don't want to do it, right? So in addition, it may be that even if in the future it is relatively easy to deal with this problem, it would nevertheless be much easier if we start working on them already. So considering all this, it seems that we have reasons to start caring about this and to start working with a long-termist approach. So that's what I will address now. What are the implications that what we have seen have for how we could drive our activism right now to have the better possible impact in the future? So a long-termist approach, I would say, would probably need to have the following guidelines, to follow these guidelines. So one is, it should aim at consolidating progress rather than, for instance, achieving things like, I don't know, the improvement of the situation of animals right now, or the reduction of the numbers of animals that are harmed right now. It should aim at achieving goals that in the future will significantly reduce the harms that animals suffer, and that can better lead the way to have a much better future for animals. Then in addition, it should consider all forms of harm, not just some of the forms of harm that some animals suffer, and not just some animals and not others. And then finally, it should consider the potential trends, the potential trajectories that those ways of harming or disconsidering animals may have in the future. So I'll now explain in a brief way, because we don't have much time to address this, what each of these points may entail. So in the case of consolidating progress, it says that this can imply at least a couple of things. The first one is that we should probably focus on attitudinal changes rather than changes in behavior. What that means is that instead of, for instance, trying to move people to refraining from doing things that harm animals, for instance, instead of getting people not to use animal products, we should have a focus on changing the way they see animals. And this, if done in the right way, will likely lead them to have a different behavior toward non-human animals. But what this would imply, for instance, is that we would prefer, for instance, to lead people to have an attitude that opposes speciesism, even if, for instance, they don't have the willpower to become vegan after that, but somehow they think that doing that would be the right thing. It's just that they lack the willpower so to do so. What I want to argue is that this would be better than, for instance, getting someone to stop eating meat or eating animal products for reasons that have nothing to do with the interests of animals. Just because, I don't know, they think, for instance, that that's more healthy, or not just that it's healthier, but that it's good for, I don't know, the environment or what have you. Because the first kind of changes are more likely to consolidate into leading society to be different, and eventually then leading to less animals being harmed. In addition, we should note here that institutional changes are likely to be of particular importance out of this. Why? Because institutional changes somehow can lead us to make those attitudinal changes that different people have something that is somehow upgraded to the level of society as such, not at the individual level. So to put an example or a couple of examples of what each of these things would imply, in the case of the focus on attitudinal changes, it should lead us to do much more work in challenging speciesism, leading more people to understand the concept of speciesism, understand the reasons against them, and rejecting speciesism. And then it should also lead us to spread concern for all forms of sentience. So, for instance, sometimes some animal advocates tend to be focused on just certain animals that are more sympathetic to people, or, for instance, to focus only on mammals or on vertebrates. And it seems that this would lead us to consider all other sentient beings as well. And also, and this is important, maybe sentient beings that will exist in the future and don't exist at the present time. And in the case of institutional changes, as I said, upgrading somehow these changes from the individual level to society's level will help to reinforce those attitudinal changes, and also will help to prevent future setbacks and future regressions. So once ideas that many people have are somehow reinforced, maybe by the law, or are accepted as kind of uncontroversial in one society, it's much more difficult that we will come back to the point where they were not considered. Then, what about the second point I mentioned, considering all forms of harm? Well, here we should defend all sentient animals, including those that are typically disregarded. For instance, invertebrates, for instance, animals that we consider maybe not aesthetically appealing, right? Because in the future, they may be among those that are the primary victims of significant ways of harming other sentient beings. And also, this should lead us to address wild animal suffering. Now, currently, it's been estimated that in the wild, there may be between 10 to the power of 18 and 10 to the power of 20 or 21 wild animals, sentient wild animals around. So that means that wild animal suffering really is a serious issue. And as I wanted to explain to you before, until a dog that lives with me came here and wanted to somehow boycott my presentation. You didn't see the dog, but you probably heard the dog when I was speaking about this and she was trying to interrupt me. The thing is that because most wild animals reproduce by having very large numbers of offspring, and they typically die when they are very young. It makes sense to think that wild animal suffering is, well, it's rather common, and that it may be even that suffering can prevail among many animals. So this is a serious issue. And then it's a serious issue we should be concerned as well, because otherwise we could just prevent some forms of harm and not others. Then what does this imply in the case of typically disregarded animals? As I said, a focus of aquatic animals that is starting to be seen now among some animal organizations seems to be important. And as I say, in the vertebrates, this should be of primary concern for us. And in the case of wild animal suffering, there are different things that we should be doing about this. So first is spread concern about the need to help wild animals. Second, challenge the idyllic view of nature, of the wild, according to which animals do great and there is nothing we need to do about their situation. And also support research on new ways to help animals, develop more knowledge about this. So considering all these different things could lead us to, in the future, maybe just a few decades from now, we would be in a much better position to somehow expand the different ways that already exist to help wild animals. And finally, what about the trends? What about the different trajectories that the future could have that can potentially affect non-human animals? So this is obviously more speculative here. We don't really know what's going to happen in the future. I just presented several possibilities, and it may well be that some of them take place and others don't. We just don't know. According to good practice in philosophy and science, we could have a precautionary approach or a Bayesian approach, according to which we just consider what we find more or less likely to be the case in light of the evidences we have. But nevertheless, we can be cautious and pay attention to what indicators we have concerning what are the possible routes or trajectories that the future may have that can affect sentient beings. So this means that first, in order to consider this, we should engage in very open-minded thinking. That is, we should have we should accept a speculative approach. So we should be ready to consider options that most people may think are crazy, but that if we pay close attention, we see as possible. Just as, for instance, we could just a few years ago be considering in the case of the development, for instance, of insect farming, right? That wasn't something that was in the radar of the majority of animal advocates, but still some people who were aware of developments in the industry could have very well foreseen. And accordingly, they could have tried to influence activism in order to try to prevent these new forms of exploitation to occur. And then another possibility may be to identify targeted strategies. So this is much more difficult. What is a targeted strategy? Well, in my presentation, I've been addressing very broad ways or courses of action concerning, for instance, the need to spread an interest in, for instance, animals that are typically disregarded, concerning the need to spread anti-speciesism, the need to focus, for instance, on attitudinal changes, etc., etc. But there may be other strategies that address very specific points. Now, what would these strategies be? Well, we just don't know. I don't know, because what I'm saying here is that we should just try to identify them. But just to put, just to consider an example of this, there are currently, as you are all well aware of, efforts of very different kinds in order to develop alternative foods, alternative proteins, alternative products that taste and maybe nutritionally similar to animal products, with the aim of substituting these products. Now, I don't know whether in the long term this is a great strategy or not, but this would be an example of a targeted strategy where we address in particular one thing. We identify one particular way in which people working in a very specific field can somehow attain something that can have ripple effects that are extremely beneficial for animals. And as I say, I don't know if this is the case in this particular example, but And regardless of whether this is the case or not here, we could also identify, as I say, other cases where targeted strategies may work. And concerning finally all this, and here I'll be saying, yeah, just the last point today in my presentation, I want to stress the need to have this open mind that I mentioned before. So many people think that if we, for instance, address the general public with a message focused on animals such as invertebrates, especially when we consider that even some people, even among animal activists, may have doubts about which invertebrates are sentient or not. Well, according to the views of many people, this is very controversial and we shouldn't be doing this. We should be doing much more respected work. But if what I have said makes sense, then we should reject this view and we should be ready to take this more ambitious work. And yes, be ready to spread concern about this. But not only that, as I said, we should be more speculative. During my presentation, I've spoken of sentient beings in general, and this means that there may be other sentient beings in the future that are not non-human animals. For instance, there may be, for all we know, things like, I don't know, artificial consciousness. There could be then future forms of sentience that are not biological. Is this a possibility that is real? Yes, it is real. And yet most people may think that, well, maybe this is like just a sci-fi scenario, a crazy scenario, but maybe we should consider this as a possibility. And this would be in line with what I'm saying, with having an open mind. And also concerning other forms in which, other ways in which animals may be harmed in the future. I mentioned before that wild animal suffering may be expanded. So here you have an example of this. This is a piece of news actually from a respected journal, which is Nature, where they are speaking about the tardigrades that didn't survive across landing on the moon. So 3 years ago already, that was in 2019, if I recall correctly, an Israeli moonlander crashed. And what happened here is that this ship was carrying certain invertebrates, tardigrades, which are the most resistant one. So who knows what kind of scenarios could happen in the future that may imply expanding either animal exploitation or wild animal suffering. And finally, concerning the point I mentioned before regarding the possibility of other forms of non-human sentience that are not biological, we just don't know whether this is possible or not, but we have no reasons to think it's not, because the reason why we are sentient, where we have experiences that may be positive or negative, it's not magic. It's just that our nervous systems process information in complex ways. So it may be that there are other ways to process this information that is not biological, for all we know. And in order to claim that this is not crazy, that this is adequate for us to think about, we may consider the case that I mentioned before, how industrial farming, how factory farming was not considered a serious threat by animal advocates existing before then, just because they had a short-termist approach and they couldn't imagine this. So we shouldn't have the same problem here. We should be more daring, and we should have no fear of thinking of scenarios that may sound a bit, unbelievable at first. So finally, if you want to learn more about this, I would recommend certain materials. So yeah, Animal Ethics, the organization I work with, has some material about this. You can watch this video on YouTube, which is part of a YouTube video course on wild animal suffering that includes also many materials about other issues concerning, for instance, ethics and animals, sentience, and other relevant topics. And yeah, there are other pieces that we've published that may be relevant to this, like this piece here. And there is a chapter in this ebook that you can download at Animal Ethics website. And then other than animal ethics, there are other organizations that may be working about some of the issues we have mentioned here. And for those of you interested in more speculative, but anyway, relevant topics here, I would recommend this podcast by the Sentience Institute, in particular, this interview to Tobias Baumann, who works at the Centers for Reducing Suffering, and was interviewed by Jamie Harris about this topic. So yes, that would be it. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope this was useful, and I'm looking forward for your challenging questions.
Thank you so much for your extremely interesting and constructive and excellently explained presentation. In one of the solutions, you have mentioned supporting research on the new ways to help animals and eliminate speciesism. I would like to ask you, what are your suggestions on this? And then we will move to questions from the attendees.
Right. So, I mean, there are different things there, right? So, to address the issue of speciesism, it seems that, and this is something that happens in particularly in the English-speaking world, because, for instance, when you consider the work that has been done in the French-speaking world, or in the Spanish-speaking world, or the Italian-speaking, well, in Italy actually, there has been much more work on speciesism. So speciesism is like common language in animal advocacy. While in the English-speaking world, you don't see that. The focus is in other things, like preventing animal cruelty, for instance. Some organization, that would be their motto, so to speak. Others may speak about veganism, but just focus on maybe behavioral changes. Or even if they consider the interests of animals, they never do it in a way that really addresses speciesism, or for that matter, the interests of beings like invertebrates and so on. So I think that this would be very relevant, that a focus on you know, addressing these topics may make a significant difference. Also, it would be something that it would be easier for many people to accept, because and this is something that I have been testing in you know, at my courses at the university, but also when I give talks, that when you first present them the reasons against speciesism, the public is much more likely to accept them if you present them before you speak about veganism than after you speak about veganism. So if instead you speak just about veganism and then you speak about anti-speciesism, then they are like, well, because they already know the implications, they are like more reluctant to examine this. But then it happens also the other way around. When they have heard beforehand the arguments against speciesism, they are more likely then to accept the arguments for veganism than when they haven't. So yeah, I think this would be really important in the long term, in order to consolidate a change at the level of society concerning what kind of relation we could have with animals. And sorry, you mentioned something else in your question, but because I just spoke about speciesism, I forgot about that. So if you can repeat it.
Oh, no, I think there was just one question from me, and that's a very interesting technique, talking about veganism and then speciesism and backwards. It's interesting. I'm going to try this with my students, because I only spoke about veganism and I didn't really try talking about speciesism first and then shift to veganism. Thank you. So the questions from the attendees, the first one, I've looked into the question of the potential expansion of factory farming to space. I wonder if you have any view on that.
Well, I think that neither me nor anyone really can come up with more information, like empirical information, because this is a field that has not been developed yet. It's still relatively speculative, but this is something that may well happen. I mean, there's been some discussion about that, concerning, for instance, the colonization of Mars and so on. So this may be eventually a reality, regardless of the technical particularities of this. And if humans eventually, colonize other planets, other worlds, and if we reach if when we reach the point where this happens, animals continue to be exploited, then that means that animal exploitation will just start to multiply. And then it may happen that in some, I mean, and this sounds like a crazy discussion, but it's not that crazy really when you think carefully about that. And the interesting thing there is that suppose this happens, suppose that humans colonize Mars, they bring animals with them, and animal exploitation expands there, and then eventually the Earth becomes vegan. Well, then we still have animal exploitation in Mars. You know, this is crazy, but it's real. And the same could happen also in the case of wild animal suffering. I have just mentioned the case of tardigrades brought to the moon, but then there is a paper published at the Journal of Applied Philosophy by Gary O'Brien, who is someone who has been working about this topic, and he explained how among scientists, one issue that has been discussed is that of directed panspermia, which is sending microorganisms to different planets and just wait that life develops there. So this, again, this may be a very speculative and crazy idea, but it's something that scientists are actually discussing. And this could, again, potentially create the wild animal suffering scenario that may be very bad for animals. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
Thank you. I hope it answered the question. Our next question is, speciesism is commonly aimed at farmed animals, both land and aquatic. Despite many reports by Food and Agricultural Organization and the UN about the climate change and the effect of animal agriculture on our planet and humans, people do not take this issue seriously. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so of course we all know that's happening, and that's very worrying. And of course, we could point at those other reasons that there are against animal exploitation that don't have to do with the interests of animals, have to do with other considerations that are mainly anthropocentric. But if what I've said before is right, that means that we should be focusing on spreading concern about this, focused on the interests of animals themselves. I guess that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you. What is your opinion regarding global awareness and animal protection education in many Asian countries where animal protection is weak, and what approach you consider the most effective?
Right. So I think that those two questions should be directed not to me, but to Lou here, who knows much more about the topic than I do. And anyway, yeah, it should be people from Asia, not people from outside Asia, that should address this topic. It would be arrogant from me to assess this. I may just say that nevertheless, it may be the case that there are some trends going on internationally, and that many of the things that I mentioned before are happening internationally, like the development of new forms of animal exploitation all around the world. So for instance, with aquatic farming, well, Asia is being like the leading force. So countries like China, India, and Vietnam are leading the way there. And that's why it seems that the whole area should be one of the world regions where animal advocacy in this sense would be more needed. Also, having said this, maybe speaking about Asia is also a generalization, because the situation in countries like, I don't know, India may be very different from the situation of China. The situation East Asian countries may be very different from the situation in Central Asia and so on. But nevertheless, as I said, I think that it's Asians who should be answering this question. If you want, I can tell you what I think of what's going on in Southern Europe and in Spanish-speaking countries. But yeah.
Well, I think
that wasn't the question. So
I think the question was not really focused on Asian countries, but probably the attendee wanted to hear your approach and maybe take some approach or similar approach and apply it in Asian countries, where in many Asian countries, animal law either doesn't exist, or if it exists, the legislation is not enforced. Yeah. But I hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please go ahead.
Oh no, it's fine. You can suggest your thoughts if you have any.
No, well, I mean, I'll just say, yeah, just one thing, which is that I understand that the development of work in animal law, it's typically correlated to the expansion of concern about what happens to animals in other, in other fields as well. So when concern for animals is spread in society, that's when you start to see other things like the development of animal law courses, but also courses in animal studies in other fields, and all sort of initiatives to help animals. So, for instance, in recent years, we've seen this in the Spanish-speaking world, especially in Latin America, in countries like Argentina. Argentina is currently one of the leading countries, I believe, in when it comes to working in animal law, and that has happened basically because there's been a huge development, a huge growth in animal advocacy in general, and Chile also has been seen a similar process. So it seems that by doing the kind of work that I mentioned before in spreading concern for the long term for animals, you will also be having these spillover effects. So these include, for instance, that maybe not in the very, very near future, but in the relatively, maybe in the midterm, or maybe, I don't know, maybe not just a year, 2 years from now, but maybe within a year, you could start seeing significantly work being done also in the field of animal law. So yeah, I guess, yeah, maybe this can be used as a kind of response to the question, even if it wasn't really.
Yeah, I hope it answered the question. Okay, and I think we have the last question. I have a question about how much the animal protection movement should embrace the term speciesism, given its foundation in Peter Singer's text, Animal and Liberation. In it, Singer would tolerate the killing of farmed animal in happy farms, in quotation marks, and if no discrimination among similar beings were present. Against this paradigm, I'm wondering if the more ethical approach would be to advocate for abolitionism. Any thoughts here would be appreciated. That's the question from Raj Reddy. Thanks, Raj.
Okay, well, thank you. And in general, thanks everyone for your great questions. So the term speciesism was coined by Richard Ryder. Singer then made it more popular in animal liberation, but the term has been coined already a few years before. So that was in 1970. And speciesism, which is discrimination against those who don't belong to a certain species, has many different forms. The main one being the main one in our case is anthropocentric speciesism. In our case, by that I mean the main way in which human beings in 2022 discriminate in speciesist ways. Is anthropocentric speciesism. That is discrimination against those who are not human beings. There are other forms of speciesist discrimination. So for instance, when we discriminate against, say, I don't know, pigs or cows or I don't know, hens, in comparison to, for instance, dogs and cats, that's a form of speciesism. We are discriminating against some non-human animals in comparison to others, just because we use the former and not the latter. Also, when we discriminate against invertebrates and give them less consideration than vertebrates, that's also a form of speciesist discrimination. When we discriminate against the animals that are aesthetically less attractive to many human beings, that would be also a form of speciesist discrimination. What are the consequences that speciesism has? Well, it has several different implications. One of them is that humans disregard the interest of non-human animals when they can somehow benefit from things that harm them, including maybe the use, or mainly the use of non-human animals, their exploitation, right? This is not the only way in which humans are speciesists or are anthropocentric speciesists. For instance, when you see a non-human animal that is in need of help, and you could help the animal, and you would help the animal if it were a human being, but just because because that animal, she's or he's not a human being, but it's a non-human animal, you don't help that animal, then that's also a form of speciesism. So, for instance, if suppose that there is some natural disaster, and that natural disasters, I don't know, say there are some floods or some particularly harsh winter or whatever, and that's affecting very severely human beings, but also, of course, other animals. And typically, rescue programs and protocols aiming at rescuing the victims of these disasters just help human beings, not non-human animals. And if they help non-human animals, sorry, it may be just some domesticated ones, not those being in the wild. Why? Obviously, due to speciesism. So this would be another consequence of speciesism. And then also, suppose you have, I don't know, someone who is a vegan and is involved in advocacy, helping human beings. And but that person is a vegan. That person is not harming non-human animals. And then you encourage that people to do activism to help wild animals or exploited animals. And that person, suppose that this person tells you, look, I'm already a vegan, I don't harm non-human animals, but I prefer to use my time helping humans rather than non-human animals, because humans are more important. Don't you know any people like this? I do know many people like this. There are such people. And their attitude is a speciesist one. They are being speciesist, and they are vegans, but nevertheless, by being vegan, what they are doing is refraining from harming animals. But nevertheless, they are discriminating against non-human animals in comparison to humans. So that's a form of speciesism. Speciesism is a form of discrimination, and discrimination is a comparative term, right? So you don't even need to treat someone badly in order to be harming someone in order to discriminate that individual. You just need to be treating that individual comparatively worse to the first one in order to discriminate that individual. For instance, suppose that someone is donating money that that individual could use for his or her own benefit, but that person decides to donate it to help others. But suppose that this person, I don't know, just prefers to use it to help Europeans, and that person uses some money maybe to help people from, say, Africa, but uses much more money to help Europeans. Why? Because this person is a racist. Now, this person is not necessarily, maybe this person is harming African people, but depending on the way this person is doing this, he or she may not be harming African people. Actually, he or she may be just helping them, but less than Europeans, because he is racist. And the same happens in the case of speciesism. And this is very, very widespread. This is extremely common. So this shows why the abolition of the exploitation of non-human animals is just one of the consequences of anti-speciesism, right? And you don't even need to accept anti-speciesism to be for the abolition of animal exploitation. You may be a speciesist, as I say, but still think that, oh, animal exploitation is horrible, we should end it, right? We should abolish it. But if you are against speciesism, then it seems clearly that you should reject animal exploitation, because no one really is supporting the exploitation of human beings, and because the interests of human beings in harming animals are clearly less significant than the interests of non-human animals in not being harmed. Now, concerning this other question that was encapsulated in the question that was made, this that Peter Singer would accept the killing of happy animals, from I think it's 2013 or 2014, I don't remember exactly that date, he has changed his views. In this book, The Point of View of the Universe, which was co-authored by him and by also Catherine de Lazaret, they assume a different viewpoint. They accept the view from then on, or Singer accept the view from then on, that what matters is whether someone has positive or negative experiences. Before that, Singer held the preferentialist viewpoint, according to which what happens is that what is good or bad for you is whether your preferences are frustrated or satisfied. And he then thought that due to this, well, I would disagree with that, but he then thought that due to this, if you didn't have a clear preference for continuing to be alive, and if you weren't able to make plans for the future and so on, and see yourself towards time, then you didn't have an interest in living. But now he abandoned this view, and since then, since all sentient beings, all sentient animals can have positive experiences, then death would be a harm for them, because death would deprive those beings from those positive experiences. And then Singer now has to accept that death is a harm for animals, and due to this, killing animals is a harm to them, and it's something that we shouldn't be doing. But nevertheless, I mean, that's just a point concerning what are the views that Peter Singer has, but that doesn't really concern us necessarily. What we should be concerned about is what are the reasons, because we may disagree with Peter Singer, but that doesn't mean that a concept that Singer, among many others, used, if the concept is good, of course we should be using them, even using that concept, even if we don't agree with all the things he claims. I, for instance, agree with many things he says, but for instance, I'm not a utilitarian like he is. I am rather an egalitarian. I believe that the interests of those who are faring worse are more important and have priority over benefiting the situation of those who are in the best situation. So, for instance, I think that if some individuals are at this level of well-being and some individuals are at this level of happiness or of suffering, for instance, say this is minus 100 and this is 500, I believe that if I can put them in an equal situation, that would be desirable, even if the overall amount of happiness were less significant. But that doesn't mean that I don't recognize the other points where I may be in agreement with, be Singer or be anyone else. So in the case of speciesism, and not just Singer and not just Richard Ryder have used the concept. Fortunately, now more and more people are using the concept in animal advocacy, and I think we should encourage more and more people to do so. That doesn't mean that we should abandon other concepts like that of abolition, but it does mean that we should give speciesism much more attention than it has received thus far.
Well, thank you so much for this very detailed answer. That's it for questions. Just a quick note that Oscar Horta's upcoming book, Making a Stand for Animals, will be available for pre-order in June. You can find the link in the chat box. You can find the reviews and the table of content in case you're interested. The recording of this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel probably next week, and you can find it also on our website. Thank you again, Oscar, for being our guest. Your presentation was wonderful.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words. And again, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the great work you do. Thanks, Lou, for the presentation. And yeah, thanks also, of course, to everyone who has watched this presentation, and the people asking the questions. And yeah, I just hope that this has been of some use, and that this can encourage further discussion by other people more apt than me to be able to make a difference for all sentient beings in the future.
Yeah, the questions were really nice and challenging. Thank you so much to the attendees. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, and I believe it's evening where you are, and have a great the rest of your day.
Thank you. Oh, by the way, and thanks for pronouncing my name properly. No English speaking person does, so that's something I really appreciate.
Thank you. It's really flattering that I did it correctly.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.